firstly, thank you so much for doing this. And I don't know how it is in the US right now in terms of very busy with exams and everything, but I know right here it is. So thanks, Steve, for taking some time out. And thank you, Dan, anyway. I'm sure it's busy even if it's not exams. So thank you for being a part of this.
Absolutely.
And I know a lot of people know about your work. I was telling some of my friends, I was like, oh, I'm doing this call. I'm doing with this, with the professor who did the gorilla study, and they were like, oh my God, I know that. And they study commerce. And so it's very unknown and everyone's very excited about this. So thank you so much.
Sure. You might not know that Steve's actually in the video.
No, I did not.
I think I always assume that the reason people miss the gorilla is because they're too captivated by my slick basketball moves.
He has amazing turn. It's like, yeah, really compelling.
Oh my goodness. I'm going to have to watch it again. Mine was not pointed out by any of the professors at UNSW when they showed it to us. That is so good. I will watch it. I think everyone will now go back and watch that video. So that's great. So I'm going to start off just by asking both of you to tell us a bit about yourself for those who may not know. Anyone can start.
Sure. Do you want to start, Steve?
Yeah. So I guess I got my start in psychology, really interested in things like emotion and emotional development and motivation, and really with very scant interest in things like attention and cognitive psychology. And then at the time that I went to graduate school, there was a new professor who was just starting up a lab there, who was doing really awesome work, and his name was Dan Simons. And so we started up a collaboration, and it was amazing just how much the way our minds work just kept surprising me. Surprised Dan knew a lot more about the mind at the time, but I think it was surprising to you too.
Yeah.
And so one attention experiment led to another, constantly surprising us, and it just became obsessed with it, and my whole direction of research just. I said, I'm going to work with Dan and learn about the mind and learn about the attention and cognition, and that's how I got turned on to that area of the field. When I got out of graduate school, I was left with sort of twin passions at that point. I was like, I just really love this attention and cognitive psychology aspect of the field that I've just spent these several years learning about. But at the same time, I still had these remaining interests in emotion and motivation and individual differences. Why people who are high in anxiety might act or think differently than people who are low in anxiety. And so what I spent the next few years trying to do was sort of try to, instead of being drawn and quartered by my interests, where I'm just trying, doing a little bit of this here and a little bit of there, try to bring them together and to put together a research program that took what I had learned about cognitive psychology from Dan and try to meld it with my work or my interest on emotion and individual differences. And that sort of, the intersection is sort of what I guess characterizes my work to this day.
That's so interesting. And what is your current project? What are you currently working on that you can tell us about?
Well, so for example, one of the things that Dan and I worked on together, and I don't want to describe Dan's research because
that's okay. Go for it.
Was inattentional blindness, and what that refers to is it's a very robust, widespread phenomenon where if your attention is on one thing, you're paying attention to something that you think might be important, something equally important could go right in front of your eyes, and you won't see it. People have this intuition that seeing is something that the eyes do, right? You look one way and you look another, and just because your eyes register that information, it's going to make it into your conscious awareness. But what inattentional blindness shows is that your eyes can register all this information from you, but if your attention is preoccupied on something else, then it just won't make it into awareness. You can literally miss very important things that appear right in front of your eyes. So since then, what I've done is I've combined it with my research, my interest on emotion. So one thing that we know about emotional stimuli and emotional information that's out there is they grab our attention. it's almost as if we're wired to prioritize and pay attention to things that resonate with us emotionally. Well, building off of the inattentional blindness work, then I started to look at, well, since we know that emotional stimuli grab our attention without us necessarily meaning them to, what consequences does this have for our ability to see other things around us? And so a lot of my work over the past decade and a half has been looking at this phenomenon that we've called emotion-induced blindness, where people are looking for a single target that's going to appear right in front of their eyes. But if you flash up an emotional image, all of a sudden they can't see the one thing that they're looking for and looking right at. And we've branched off and done other areas, researched other areas of psychology as well, other areas of attention. But this phenomenon has really been a constant in the work that I've been doing.
It's funny that, we both actually started in areas that are largely unrelated to what we do now. So I also started in cognitive development. I was initially studying memory development and then wanted to switch to kind of perception of objects and concepts and categories, but developmentally. And my graduate advisor was somebody who did cognitive development as his primary area. And I spent about 3 years trying to figure out how preschoolers figured out what was inside different kinds of objects, right? It's a fundamental question about what sorts of inferences a kid can make, knowing only about what objects are, what they do, but not necessarily having seen inside them, right? So do they know that there are different things inside a machine and inside an animal, right? And I was interested in sort of the vision science question. How do they recognize that this is a thing that's going to have biological stuff in it as opposed to gears, right? So I spent a few years doing that and got interested in the related question, which was how do people make sense of different kinds of objects, and how do they keep track of their properties, right? So there's too much information to keep track of in the world, and how do you know what you should keep track of and what you shouldn't? And one of the questions might be, well, animate things, people, animals, objects, not living objects can change their shape, right? They walk, they move, they distort their shape. Rigid objects generally don't. If you have a phone, it's not going to change its shape, right, for the most part. So I figured one way to look at this would be to make changes to objects and then see if people are keeping track of that information. They should notice the change. If they're not keeping track of it, maybe they'll miss the change. So I just set up some simple displays, tried it out with adults to kind of get materials working. We just had a single object, and actually had the little animated truck that would go by, and the object would be replaced by a distorted object that changes shape. And we wanted to see, okay, do people notice these changes to animals more, or do they notice changes to objects more? Turns out nobody noticed anything. So that started an entire line of research on what people do and don't notice, that this phenomenon of change blindness, a failure to notice differences from one moment to the next. And a fellow graduate student at the time, Dan Levin, and I started looking at changes in movies, right? So when people make an editing mistake, a lot of people think that they always notice those in movies. In reality, almost nobody notices anything in movies. And we kind of pushed the extremism of that to the point that we were changing a single actor and performing a simple action in a movie. So a person gets up from their desk, walks out into a hall and answers a phone, and we changed the person to somebody else, and found that a lot of time people didn't see that. Then we did it in the world. We had somebody asking directions, and we have a couple of people come by carrying a big door and replace the person who was asking directions with somebody else. And a lot of people don't notice that. So it led to this long, sort of prolonged study of what sorts of information are we completely oblivious to a lot of the time? What sorts of things do we notice? And really the critical thing is the point that Steve made earlier, which is people assume that they will notice things that in reality most people don't, right? And that mismatch between what we actually see and what we think we're going to see is really important, right? Because if you think you're going to notice automatically if something important happens right in front of you, that means you won't take steps to make sure that you'll notice it. So if you're driving and you think, oh, well, I'll notice if I need to stop suddenly, right? I'll notice if somebody runs the stop sign and I need to stop. So it's okay if I do things like talk on the phone, right? You're not taking steps to avoid distraction and to focus attention on the right things that you need to, because you have this intuition that it won't matter. If my eyes are directed at it, I'll see it. And that intuition is really dangerously wrong. in situations like driving, where we're doing things that our visual system didn't really evolve to do, going much faster than we normally ever would. So, over the last couple of decades, I've kept working on inattentional blindness sorts of questions and trying to understand the mechanisms of it. A lot of that work is not quite as entertaining as videos with people in gorilla suits, but it's you can kind of better control what you're doing using computer-based displays, more precise timing, so you can systematically see what matters, what kinds of attention matter, what holds attention, what doesn't, and look to see how, for example, how similar things are, how similarity of what you're looking for and what you're paying attention to, whether that affects whether or not you notice, or to look at individual differences, which is something we've tried to do a bit. So a lot of those same sorts of questions kind of pervade what I do now.
And sort of highlighting Dan's point, I think about just how these intuitions are so widespread and have really dangerous potential consequences. I remember a while back, I used to give some talks to traffic safety or conferences. And I went and I gave a talk to a conference of traffic safety instructors, people who would teach, and one of them raised their hand. They said, well, I was always told that, before you cross the street or you drive through an intersection, at least make sure that the other driver's eyes are pointed towards you, so that you know that you've been seen. So even among the people who are charged with the responsibility of training, new drivers to be safe on the road, these intuitions can lead to really, negative or really bad assumptions, really wrong assumptions that can lead to, bad consequences. But by the way, as Dan said, you already said that a lot of the students you've talked to are familiar with his gorilla study, but probably just as many of them are familiar with his famous door study as well, where the door walks between people who are having conversation. One of them is Dan.
Yeah, I'm in that video. I look quite a bit different.
No, as you mentioned it, that one kind of flashed my memory as well. I remember seeing that one as well. No, I think the work you're both doing is really fascinating, and I'm definitely going to read into it a bit more when I finish this call, because I'm very fascinated by it. But coming back to a perspective of students who aren't psych students, but taking the concepts that you've been looking at in terms of students might think that just because they're looking at, for example, their screen and they're studying, they're paying attention to it. But you know what? They're probably not. And I can say I'm not when I study. Have you found any ways to improve that? Like how do you fix that? How can, by, how we have this intuition that you're just looking at something, so you're paying attention to it. How do you reverse that bias and make them realize to actually pay attention?
Should I go first, Steve?
Sure, go ahead.
So I think one thing to keep in mind is that you can't suddenly train your attention to be able to take in everything all at once or to multitask effectively. Nobody can, right? What we can do is switch back and forth between things somewhat efficiently, but you really can't do multiple things at the same time and actually do them all just as well. And a lot of people have the intuition that they can, because it's just, when you're distracted, you don't realize how distracted you are, right? And that's a big challenge. One thing that I run across a lot in my teaching, and when I teach introductory psychology students, is I'll have a student come to my office hours after bombing an exam, right? And they're freaked out. They've never bombed an exam before, because we get good students, and they're not sure why they did poorly, because they read the textbook 3 times. And I'll sit down with them and go through, how did you read the textbook? And like the first thing they say, well, I highlighted all the important bits, and say, well, okay, there's the first problem. Stop doing that. Because you will use that as a crutch and say, okay, this is important. Let me highlight it, but not actually internalize it, so that when you come back to it, it's highlighted, but you don't actually remember it. It's just there on the page. And this actually comes from the same principles as change blindness and inattentional blindness. We assume that if we can recognize something when we see it, that we must have it in our head, right? If you are talking to that person, giving them directions, well, I must have it in my head. I must remember what I saw. When in reality, it's probably not there, right? So one of the things that I do as a study check with these students is, okay, you've read this section here, this section headed whatever the topic is, cognitive dissonance, just pick a topic. you've read this topic and you said you've read this 3 times. Okay, I'm going to cover that section. What does it say? What's it about? No idea, because they recognize it. It looks familiar. And as they read through it, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that. But they're not actually recalling it. They're just recognizing it. And that's a huge difference, because if you've got somebody who's writing a good test, whether it's an essay test or a multiple choice test, if it's a multiple choice test, they're going to give you example options, answers that are all going to look familiar. So you're not, if you don't have it in your head, you can't rely on that sense of feeling like you know it to get it right. If it's an essay, you have to recall it. So I think one of the best things you can do is actually test your knowledge. And testing is one of the best ways to learn in general. So the challenge for that is it takes effort. It's not fun. So you have to be able to push yourself to try and recall the information, see if you actually do know it, just kind of like a flashcard. And that is a good test for whether you actually get it.
Yeah, I totally agree with Dan. And it's actually got, it's actually in the literature called the testing effect, or sometimes it's called retrieval practice, where it's almost like greasing the track along which you're retrieving those memories, right? The more you practice pulling it out of memory, the more you practice recalling that information, the easier it is to recall it next time. There's actually been studies where people have, so one group of participants has read material and then read it again, and another group read it, but then instead of reading again, they tested themselves on it. And what's been shown several times is that the people who read it and then tested themselves on it actually did better on recalling that information down the road than the people who read it more times. And it gets also to something called depth of encoding, which I think, Dan, would you agree that it's probably one of the most widely replicated findings in the field, that the more deeply you encode something, the more deeply you encode the meaning of information, and as you're reading material, maybe think about how it connects to other things you know, or think about, imagine yourself interacting with that material, imagine yourself in that, which is again called, that's called the self-reference effect. These kinds of elaborations really help that material stick. And if you compare that to the strategy of highlighting, or again, like Dan said, it's just very superficial. You're not ingraining that information. You're not thinking about it any more deeply than just, its existence on the page. And so there are a lot of strategies that psychologists have, come up with that are effective in helping people study and remember.
Yeah, and this isn't just for rote memory, right? It's not just, the purpose of most tests shouldn't just be, can you regurgitate what you read before? That's not learning, that's just memorization. There are strategies that I really like when reading a textbook or reading materials, which is to write notes in the margins, not about what's in that section, but about how that section relates to some other section.
That's
right.
Neat.
So drawing a connection between a failure to remember something in change detection and a study of memory and when people don't remember it. Things that come up in your mind as you're reading that section, even things that are related to your own daily life, those are memory cues that are much richer than highlighting a section or just the name of a study or something arbitrary like that. So the more connections you can build between things, even between classes, between textbooks, anything that triggers your memory, you're reading a section of a textbook and it makes you think of some play that you saw. Why? Right? Think about what that connection is and what it means. And that's going to lead to much better memory and understanding.
That's really neat. Dan, would you suggest the same strategy for people when they're sitting in the middle of a lecture? So rather than taking notes and writing down exactly what the lecturer says, make notes instead about how what they said connects to something that's already of interest to them, or yeah,
writing down everything they said isn't actually learning, right? It's stenography, which is great. It's a good skill, but it's not what you want to be doing, right? You want to be integrating, you want to be understanding what it is. And especially if you know that the notes are going to be available later, then there's no reason to write it down. Right. It's better to make those connections. So when I take notes, I'll have an outline, just the barest of outlines. And if they say something, say they mention some study, I'll just write something about that study, just a phrase that reminds me. And then I'll make notes in the margins off to the side, said, how is this related to this? I'll ask myself questions or questions that I have for, about that work. I'll just make little comments, sometimes snide, sometimes sarcastic, but I'll make comments on the side, that will help me remember it.
But and actually, I think the snide stuff can actually work in your favor, right? When people talk about engaging in visualization techniques of memory, or the method of loci, they often say the more emotional or the more bizarre you can make these connections, the more it might stick with you. I don't know if that analogy works.
The more personal.
The more personal.
And if you're just naturally a snide and sarcastic person, then that's going to help you remember it.
Yeah. And I also thought it was funny what you just said about, I remember about when there's notes that are going to be available. I mean, I remember sitting in class and knowing that notes were going to be available afterwards. But I did. So how am I going to use my time? I still felt like, well, I should be doing something. I should be writing some notes. So I'll just write down what the professor is saying, right? But that's not the most effective way to do it. I think what you said is so much better.
Yeah. And if you have a professor who's organized, and sometimes you won't realize this when you're in class. I mean, I think my favorite example of this, I was when I was getting ready to teach intro psych for the first time, I actually looked back at my college undergraduate social psychology notes, right, which tells you how much of a geek I am. I kept my undergraduate notes from a course I took my sophomore year. But looking back through them with hindsight, knowing what I know now about the field, I realized it was just a masterwork, right? Because I kind of had an outline of what he had done. And in every single lecture, he touched on the same 3 themes throughout the entire course. I had no idea until I studied the final. I remembered studying the final. I was like, wow, this was throughout here the whole time. But every single lecture brought in the same principles in different ways. And it was an intense class. But it's the sort of thing that my notes were outline, not a ton of detail, but I could see where the same themes would come up over and over again. So, just sometimes kind of taking notes where you're just getting the structure of what they're doing and trying to anticipate where it's going will get you thinking much more deeply than just sitting there and absorbing. So if you try and imagine that you were teaching this class, where would it go next? What theme is coming up, right? And if they gave you an outline at the beginning of the class and said what they were going to cover, start thinking in advance about what that's going to be, right? So as you're hearing this first part, how is that going to connect to this later part? Or they get to this later part, how did that connect to the first part? Those connections are the real knowledge. The memorization, I mean, most people are going to forget the details by the time they finish taking the final, right? Mm-hmm. The question is, did you get the ideas and the concepts and how they link together? Because you can go back and get those details. Everything's on Google now. You can go back and get it. But the integration of them, that's what you want to keep.
Mm-hmm. Another thing I just want, I'll just build off what Dan said, going back actually about 5 minutes or so ago, when he was talking about multitasking and how people assume that they're able to multitask, but we're really not able to. I think a lot of students will study with in front of the TV, or study sometimes even with the radio on or something going on.
People have TVs anymore? The students have? They don't
have
TVs anymore, right?
Good question.
We're aging ourselves, Steve.
Oh, no. YouTube or something. I don't know.
Yep.
Well, with something going on in the background. And that's a case of divided attention. You can't. It really. There have been studies. I think David Strayer did some work looking at multitasking in a driving situation where people did a secondary task while driving. And even though people thought that they could do both tasks at once, hardly anyone got away without both tasks being impaired.
It's even worse than that. Yeah. So there's another study that was done by some of my colleagues here, looked at talking on a cell phone while driving, and they looked both at the driving performance and at the conversation performance. And it turns out driving impairs your conversations too, right? It goes both directions because it's like, chewing gum and walking and talking and whistling at the same time. Using your mouth in conflicting ways doesn't work, and that, right? We know we can't do that, but we don't realize that talking on a phone is using attention in some of the same ways that driving does.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you hear all these, safety regulations about, oh, well, now you can only use hands-free mobile phones so that you're not distracted with your hands, right? but that doesn't solve the problem that your attention is off the road.
Definitely. I think some of the things you've brought up are so interesting. I've been taking like little notes. They're so one of the key concepts and ideas that you're presenting, because that is exactly how we should be studying.
And you're making connections between them. And you're making connections.
And you draw lines and show connections. I think the biggest thing to take away is that multitasking doesn't work. I think that's something that a lot of students do. And you're completely right. Rather than TV, we've got our little computers with Netflix, and then we like split our screen. And you've got Netflix playing on one side because it's like background noise. But I personally can't. Even though I've watched a show 20 times, if it's playing in the bottom corner, I'm going to want to watch it again. I'm putting it on for a reason. I like it. So I think that's something that a lot of students struggle with, is that distraction. So I guess that's one factor that affects our attention. What other things affect our attention beyond like us getting distracted? Is it something that we can change within ourselves really quickly, or is it just a matter of turning off all distractions?
You distracted me.
That was perfectly timed.
You planned that, didn't you?
I did not. I'm just very clumsy.
I'm sorry, I missed what you said. I was distracted by the pen.
No, is there anything like what can we do besides just switching off all distractions? Like, what if we got rid of everything, blocked all websites on our computers, and our attention still isn't perfect? What can we do?
Your attention's never perfect, right? That we've got limited capacity for attention, and we have limited energy too, right? So, nobody can really focus intensely with no interruption, with no distraction for, a hugely long time, right? Every now and then you can kind of get into a flow state and you can do that. I mean, that happens for me every now and then when I'm writing. I'll just get into this mode, or when I'm programming and I'll just go for 3 hours and not realize I've done it. But then I might be dead for a day and not be able to do anything, right? Most people can't say, okay, I'm going to do nothing but study for the next 2 hours and have that be effective. But yeah, I mean, turning off distractions is good. Rewarding yourself with distractions. Say, okay, for the next half an hour, I have to really focus, no distractions, and then I'll go and watch, TikTok videos or make TikTok videos or whatever it is that students do now, right? But
well, I mean, and then there are things which you hear about all the time, which I think a lot of people dismiss and go, yeah, I know that. Like, get sleep.
Yeah,
sleep is huge. It is. I mean, your brain, restores itself during sleep and prepares you for the next day, and even actually helps you consolidate memories for what you just learned in the day before you got to sleep. Although you hear about it all the time, and to the point where I think people, just dismiss it and say, I'm going to be a hero and I'm going to stay up and I'm going to study all night. That's really counterproductive.
It's pretty much the worst thing you can do.
Yeah.
Especially if the test is going to require you to do any thinking at all. The worst thing you could do is get no sleep the night before. I mean, cramming is not going to benefit you at that point.
And I'm less familiar with the evidence for this one, Dan, but maybe you know better. But sort of taking care of yourself in terms of exercise and stress relievers, like trying to not looking after your own mental health in a way. I'm less familiar with the details of the evidence in that case, but
that's
from what I've heard,
yeah, and that's going to have longer term benefits. That you'll be more efficient in how you do things, right? So, but yeah, it's taking breaks for things that you like is essential. You don't want to view it as punishment. You want to do it when you're capable of focusing. One thing that helps some people is really having a schedule that's fairly routine, so that if you have a time window when you've got an hour and a half or 2 hours between classes, and you can get yourself into a mode where during that window, that's when I work, you can really sort of reinforce that over time. So it just becomes natural that as soon as you hit that time point, this is work time, and you're in the right mental state for it. Behaviorism works, right? That's sort of conditioning yourself to, at this moment, I will be working. And if it's not working, if you're not kind of effective, then don't try it, right? you can't kind of force yourself to suddenly have attention, right? When you're already exhausted.
And I think a lot of people will tend to think of these breaks as guilty pleasures, right? But there's nothing guilty about them. It doesn't take away from your ability to, study. It actually adds to your ability to study. And not just because it gives yourself a break and is helping you look after yourself, but it's been found over and over again that if you have a choice between spending 6 hours cramming for an exam the night before and spending the same 6 hours but broken up into 1 hour segments over the days leading up, if you spread your study sessions apart with breaks in the middle, you actually are much better at retaining that information. And then if you just crammed it all, that cramming all together is something that's called massed practice. And it's been found to be much quite inferior to what's called distributed practice, where you do a little bit of a study session, take a break, do a little bit of study session either later that day or the next day, and that's been found to be have much better for keeping you from forgetting the material that you've studied.
Requires that you not procrastinate. That you have to start a little earlier, but starting a little earlier and not just doing each exam right before that exam can make a huge difference. Yeah.
It's hard for those of us who are natural procrastinators.
Yeah.
No, thank you. I think there's some really good points and something that all students really need to take into consideration. So thank you so much for everything.